After boot camp, I was sent to electronics school at Treasure Island up in San Francisco after a little basic course in San Diego. And that's where the 18-year-old kid, immature, stepped forward and got stupid. I decided I did want to go to Vietnam, and it wasn't that I wanted to go to Vietnam. I, to be totally serious and add more complexity to all of this, I decided I wanted to commit suicide. I was very unhappy in life, extremely unhappy. No valid reason for it looking back. But like I say, 18 years old. I mean, San Francisco in the summer of 67, who doesn't want to be there
Mm.
in those days? And I told my girlfriend to disappear from my life. I studied real hard so I could flunk the test logically in electronic scores because if there was a big test that came up that if you flunked it, you'd be kicked out. And I wanted to be able to justify all my answers.
To know for certain that you got them wrong.
Yes, and not accidentally pick a multiple choice correct answer. And they said, "Yeah, you're out of school. Go to the personnel office." I said, "Oh, good, thank you." Went to the personnel office and they said, "What do you want to sign up for?" And I said, "Vietnam, boats." "Well, what kind of boats?" I said, "I don't know." "What do you got?" And they gave me a list of several, one including an ATC. And I asked the guy, "What's an ATC?" He goes, "I have no idea, but they're getting in a lot of gun battles." I said, "Sign me up for that one." So that's how Vietnam came into my life.
So you go to Vietnam with the intention of, at least, at the very out, maybe before you set foot in your mind, you're thinking, here's a way. Is it not only here's a way I can go out, but here's a way I can go out in glory?
Go out in glory and not embarrass the family and not leave a mess for them to clean up. I had at least enough common sense that I didn't want to make it any harder on them than I had to, as if that's reasonable thinking.
Sure. How long did that kind of thinking hold in your mind after you arrived in Vietnam?
I know that it was still there on August 15th and 16th in a major firefight that we had, one that lasted overnight. But I think after that point, I definitely wanted to live. But it changed through the uh, first 8 months of being there. It started changing. But I didn't want to endanger any of my boat crew. No matter what, I was not going to be so stupid that I would cause their death. I'd do everything I
Right.
could to make sure the boat operated correctly and properly and do what I had to do.
Right, because in a firefight, it's pretty easy to expose yourself and to reach the goal that you had. But in doing that, you're betraying your fellow sailors, right?
Right. And I wasn't going to. No way.
Right.
No way was I going to do anything that would directly cause them any harm.
You just mentioned August 15 through August 15 and 16, 68. You said it was a major fight. Just even when you say those words, what are the things that go through your mind?
All kinds of mental images, all kinds of remembering emotions. Um,
Describe some of the images to us.
a narrow, I'm not even sure if it was a river. It might have been. The Mekong Delta is just full of not only rivers, but canals. And I think we were up a canal more than what a river. It wasn't very wide. And as we went up, and it came right out what we called the crossroads, and probably get to that in a little bit. But anyhow, as we went upstream, we got into a firefight. At the same place, there were some fish nets across the canal, and we had to zigzag around those. And I thought to myself, at that point, I was driving the boat. I was the coxswain then. I thought these could be a real nasty spot coming back out when we come out, whenever that might be. But we fought our way upstream until the tide went out. And when it did, we were basically sitting in mud, and we dropped off our army troops. And they formed a perimeter. And by that time, it was getting dark. Sunset had set. And we played catch with the Viet Cong all night with grenades. The Army and the Navy were supplying them with the grenades. And then in the morning, when the tide had come back in, we loaded the troops back up and we started fighting our way out. Got to those fish nets. And when we did a zigzag, I was headed toward the embankment, the beach. And I saw a Viet Cong stand up and fire a rocket at two boats ahead of me. And he missed. He got up again and fired at the boat directly in front of me and missed again. And both shots were aimed at the middle of the boat, but the first one hit out in the water. The second one hit at the water line, and I immediately thought, if he gets a third shot off, he's going to hit the coxswain flat where I'm standing, and I'm going to be dead, because virtually any time they got the coxswain flat, there was a death. It was just almost guaranteed, because the rocket would go inside that coxswain flat and just bounce around and kill whoever was in there. He did get his shot off, and remarkable about that, the whole time, not only were all the boats shooting at him, we also had helicopters and jets strafing his location, and he just kept standing up. And he got off that third round, and all of a sudden there was an explosion, probably the loudest noise I've heard in my life, in a sense. Everything went black, and I came to, and I was sprawled out over the steering wheel, the helm of the boat. And I started checking myself head to toe to see if I was alive, because I didn't know if I was alive or not. And I checked my hands, and I stood up and started driving the boat again, and looked behind me and saw my best friend Frank and he was a gunner, 50 caliber machine gun gunner. And the two other gunners, a 20 millimeter cannon gunner and the other 50 caliber gunner, they were tied in like a human granny knot, just mangled into each other. And Frank was mangled pretty bad, and started calling for help. And a scene that I really remember is, as I called for a medevac, one of our boats had a landing pad for a helicopter. It dropped out of formation, dropped back to me, came alongside. The Army guys in the well deck climbed up along on the side of the boat, started helping them tie the two boats together. And they had Frank in a stretcher, and they had taken him to the front of the boat and to that flat top. And all at the same time, a helicopter was landing on the flat top. Everybody's in motion, everybody's being shot at, and they're landing to take Frank out of the firefight. And that scene will never leave my thoughts, ever. It's embedded deeply. I saw every little bit as we talked, or as I talked, of that scene.
Well, and as you describe that scene, one of the things that comes to my mind is, combat vets talk about how terrible war is, how terrible combat is. They often say at the same time, though, that one of the things they sometimes miss about it is that powerful sense of camaraderie. Um, and as you're describing this, I'm just thinking of a bunch of guys, many of whom don't even know each other, but who are collaborating, cooperating in a very dangerous environment to get these wounded guys off that boat, and just that powerful sense of commitment that these soldiers and sailors had to one another in that moment. So as this Tango boat is going down the river, down the canal, you've got these soldiers on it. course, the boat has its own weaponry, the 50 cal, etc.
Yes.
When the firefight starts, you've got the Navy guys, I think you said Frank is there on the 50 cal. You've got other guys on the boat with their weapons. Are the Army guys also with their M16s? Are they also
Oh yeah.
so I mean, this
Oh yeah. They're shooting off the side of the boat. Yep.
just an absolute sheet of lead coming off, or a tsunami of lead coming off this boat.
And it's not just one boat. The
Right.
typical mission was a river division of 25 boats total, with our monitors named after the Civil War monitor, our command boat, our little speedy boats. It was quite the armada coming down the river.
Now I know, things will be different. You've got a lot of firefights. I think the count is somewhere around 100. So you've got a lot of different firefights, but generally, how long would these things last? Is it the Viet Cong hit you for 2 minutes and then it's done, or how do they go?
I have my memory. The only real memory I have in terms of length of time is it could vary from maybe a few snipers shooting off a few rounds, and we open up with everything, and that lasts us 30 seconds, and somebody of significance says ceasefire, and we stop, and we don't get any more shooting. And then others lasted into the hours. And as I mentioned, August 15th and 16th, it wasn't 24 hours, but it was probably pushing 18 ish total of almost constant fighting, shooting going back and forth.
Is this you've got kind of Viet Cong just kind of tracking you on the shore as the boats are going down the river? The VC are just kind of tracking you, and it's a running firefight?
I'm not 100% sure what they were doing, but it came across that way.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was individual ambush sites where you might hit one ambush, back away from it, go upstream, go downstream, try to beach the boats again and hit another ambush site. Uh, that would happen. I know we had a place called Snoopy's Nose that looked like the cartoon character Snoopy's nose. And they would get in the center of that nose on land and manage to get our boats shooting at each other. They would fire off a few rounds, duck their heads.
Okay.
We were completely looped around and we would open up on each other
Because you've got boats on
because we
either
couldn't
side of
shoot.
that thing that's coming out, boats on either
Yeah,
side. They shoot,
yeah,
you duck, and yeah, I see what you're
yeah,
saying. Wow.
yeah.
Now, I'm assuming you're dealing overwhelmingly with VC, maybe completely with VC. Do you have any idea if there are any NBA out there as well?
At that point in time, I did not know of any MVA. Having read over the last 50 years, apparently there were, especially for TATA 68. But I don't think we were really conscious of that many MVA. Maybe advisors, like we had advisors to local forces, they had advisors to local forces. But as far as we knew, it was just VC.
You mentioned a few minutes ago, you mentioned the crossroads, and your book is Crossroads Diary. So what was the crossroads? When we refer to the crossroads in the Mekong, what is that?
It was, I don't know how it got its specific name because, in a sense, there were a lot of crossroads of canals and rivers where it's formed like a four-way intersection.
Sure.
I mean, there was hundreds of them, but one particular area somehow picked up that name. It's near at that time a large village called Bentray, and not too far from a small city called Mito. And even before I got there, it was known for firefights. Um, Having read the daily reports from the time of the riverine force existence, I think it accounted for over 300 firefights,
Wow.
just that location. It was almost guaranteed if Army and Navy were going to that location, there was going to be a firefight. You just didn't know which street it was going to be on.
I see. Yeah.
It wouldn't be right at the intersection, it would be somewhere near it.
And
And it was
was
guaranteed.
and was it a guarantee that they always get to act on first? I mean, is it pretty much always, if not always, the case that the VC start the fight?
I think that was more common than not, but we had a lot of free fire zones
Oh,
where we were allowed to fire the odd shot to see if it would spark an ambush, especially if we thought it just looked like it was ripe for an ambush. But more often than not, they started it. And we were looking for it. Most military units go out to set up an ambush and try to avoid ambushes. And our job was to go get ambushed. And we got real good at it.
you mentioned that
And it,
about in the memoir, in the diary, you mentioned that you guys are ordered to go out and basically get shot at so we know where the enemy is and then can bring firepower on them. Is that right?
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Now there was one case when was it is his name Gomer? I forget the nickname of the guy who apparently went down and he went down and broke the engine and said we've had enough of this and so the ship doesn't work anymore. Is that what happened? I'm assuming that's what happened. It just
That's as I remember it. And
yeah,
we felt somewhat shameful, but nonetheless, what had happened the previous, or I guess really it was that morning, what was going, we'd been in a significant ambush on April 4th, a very significant, very major. And it was either later no, it had to be the next day. For once, they sent out one single boat to draw fire, and that they chose our boat. And we were out there for about 2.5 hours, just idling, going in circles, waiting to be shot at. And they had all kinds of helicopters in reserve, already loaded with troops, more boats loaded with troops. I think they had fighter jets flying overhead, ready to come in. But that's not reassuring when you're in that one boat
right.
waiting to get a rocket attack. And then we were selected to do it again the next morning. And that's where the issue came up. We couldn't handle the thought of doing that another time. And that's when Gomer silently, we were up on top of the boat having a silent conversation. Nothing was being said. We were just all looking at each other like, why is this happening? And Gomer goes, I'll be right back. And he did go down and disable the engine so it would not be noticed that he had done it.
Right.
And he said it would take about a 24-hour repair and we'd have to go back for parts to do it.
Yeah.
And we got escorted back to a repair ship. And so we kind of tucked our tails between our legs and then they canceled the operation.
Yeah.
So
I don't,
nobody went
it's
out.
hard for me to imagine anyone being critical of that, given what you'd been through the day before. Um, you mentioned Ben Trey, and that's the place that I think is, you know, attached to that famous line from Tet, we had to destroy the village to save it. Do you have any personal recollection of that? You were in that area. Do you have any personal recollection of, what happened at Ben Trey around the time of Tet when that officer, I believe it was a major, I'm not sure, but when the officer, later said, in order to save the village, we had to destroy it.
I remember Bentre and Mito, and again, this is the crossroads area. Just for weeks, it was firefight after firefight. Planes coming in with bombing, artillery rounds. It was like a almost a 2 week long battle without ceasing, 2 or 3 weeks. We would get to run to the ships once in a while just to resupply everything because we were the supply for the ground troops for the army. And I know that we were in Bentray as it happened, but I don't have any distinct memories because I didn't know we were making history.
Mm.
Maybe I would have made some mental recordings, but we were just reacting.
One of the things that,
So
we often hear is Tet was devastating to the Viet Cong. And so after that, the NVA really had to step in. But it sounds like where you were, that wasn't really the case. It sounds like where you were, the Viet Cong remained a formidable adversary after Tet.
they did. They did. Yes. Yeah, I don't recall it ever backing down because of lack of VC. And I don't recall any real uniformed prisoners or uh, dead in the water. So it was just the Viet Cong and a very hardy group in that area, whatever their local force number was.
What was your assessment of the VC as an adversary?
I think up till that August 15th, 16th battle, I saw them as a nuisance.
Mm.
But I tell you what, to see that guy stand up the far off round after round in spite of what was being shot at him, my admiration for that man and therefore for generally the ones who just stuck in the fight grew. I thought they were pretty good fighters.
I hear you. Um, you write in your memoir, you say there was a disastrous big battle on April 4th, and so that's April 4, 1968. Um,
Yes.
Even when I just recite that date to you, April 4, 1968, I imagine there are images that come to mind. What are they? What are some of the images that come to
Again, images and memories and thoughts, absolutely. Um, I know that the operation that had the major firefight was River Division 92, and I was in River Division 91. But they had taken a few of our boats to include at least three Tangos and a Monitor, which is a support boat with heavy firepower, and added it to that group because they had a reinforced battalion that they wanted to land in a area that, well, that they knew that VC were in. And I distinctly recall going upriver. They said, I think, turn your boats to the right, starboard, and beach and unload your troops. We turned our boats and we were instantly being shot at. They said, no, let's go downstream and try to flank that firefight. And I think again it was turned to the right and we hit it again, another firefight. And they said, back up, let's go down. We're going to go to the left. Now, I don't know why we're going to go to the left when all the fighting's been on the right. I had no idea. I just, follow orders. So we went down and we turned our boats to the left. We did not hit a firefight until our ramps were lowering and the Army was charging off the ramps. And then we got hit full speed ahead with everything they had. I'm going to back up just a little bit. My position in the boat at that time, I was the radio man, and I had a little steel plate slider that I could open to see outside the driving area. And I usually had it open, but that day, for some reason, I had it closed. And we hit this firefight. Even as we're backing up, some of the troops got off the boat, some of the troops didn't. Some of the troops that were off the boat and some that were on the boat were wounded. Some of the Army guys were trying to get off the land and back into the river to get to the boats. And I know that as we came off the embankment and into the river, the 20 millimeter gunner, and my boat was Tango 4, his was Tango 3, climbed to the outside, and with one hand on a guardrail to hold himself on the boat, he was yanking guys up and out, fully dressed army guys with their backpacks, their weapons. He was yanking them up out of the water onto his boat. I don't know where he got the strength to do that. I say I don't know, but I know. But nonetheless, he did it. Just full adrenaline rush to get those guys, as many as he could, out of the water back in the boats. We finally basically retreated to the crossroads. A lot of the boats seriously damaged. I think it was a River Division 91 guy had lost his life in the Coxswain Flat. He was either the radioman or the driver. Many more Navy had been wounded. A lot of Army had been wounded. But when we got back to the crossroads, we regrouped and we had enough to go back up. I think hardly more than a company. We went from a battalion down to a company and just the right amount of boats to take that company up. We ran through all three ambush sites and then dropped our troops on the left so they could work their way down to recover their dead and wounded, and found no Viet Cong. They were gone. So that's what I remember of that particular firefight. And then I say again, the next day we were in the same area, just drifting to be shot at,
Be as a
hoping we could spark.
hoping to be a target. Now,
Yeah.
you were also wounded. Was that during the battle you've told us about in August, or this battle on April 4, or was that a one of the many others?
I'll, I'll drop back to April 4th. I did not get wounded, but that slat that I had shut had 47 nicks in it
Wow.
from a machine gun, probably an AK-47. I thought that was kind of unusual to have 47 nicks from a AK-47, but I did not get wounded on that one. I actually got wounded 3 times. The Navy had a rule that if you had 3 recorded Purple Heart wounds, you would be sent home back to the States. Well, I didn't want to go back to the States. So I didn't record every single wound that I got. My first wound was August 2nd, my 20th birthday. Got some shrapnel in my leg, minor, real minor, so I saw no reason to report that. August 16th, when that rocket went off in Frank's gun mount, I got some serious shrapnel in my leg. And I didn't plan to record that one, but a radio message came to my boat. They said, "How many of you are wounded?" And I just responded, "I thank everybody," because everybody was. And they just recorded my name for Purple Heart. I didn't intend to get one even then. And then the last time I got wounded was November 10th in the evening at the end of an operation as we were headed out. And that's another story in and of itself. But that was uh, being wounded that day wasn't the tough part, but I lost my best friend that day.
Was that Sammy?
That was Sammy. Yes. Yeah. I lost him that morning in a firefight at the crossroads.
And this is the same time you're wounded?
Yeah. Well, my wound was later in the night or day in a totally different firefight in a different area, different location. We were
But
picking
same
up the guys we had dropped off.
same 24-hour day.
Same 24-hour day. Yeah.
Are you willing to share what happened with Sammy?
I am. I am. I'll back up to August 16th when Frank got wounded. His Everybody got wounded, but Frank was serious enough. We didn't know if he was going to survive. He got sent off. So when we got back to the base, Riverine base, ship base there in a big river, we received a replacement for him, and his name was Sammy Cross. And he had just arrived in country. He arrived to the boats, I think, that day, and maybe had come into Vietnam 2 days before in the Saigon. But he came aboard our boat. He was a gunner's mate, meant he handled guns, and he took Frank's place. And Even at that point in life, in August, I was backing away from making new friendships. I had lost too many friends, maybe not by death, but by serious wounds. A lot of guys. So, but I made friends with Sammy, and a few weeks later or a month later, he got transferred to a monitor. Now, on November 10th, he's on that monitor. For some reason, an acting boat captain. All I know is they didn't have a boat captain for our boat that day. So I'm the boat captain, and other guys driving the boat, and I'm setting up between the gun mounts on top of the boat, and we get into a firefight, and I can see everything because I don't have anything blocking my view. And he sees fire was called, and for some reason, unknown to anybody to this day, Sammy climbed out of his gun mount, which is a 40 millimeter cannon, on the monitor. And I know I was yelling at him, but I also know he couldn't hear me because the boats were way too loud, period. And we were too far away, probably. I'm looking around me to try to get a distance, maybe 50 yards away, less, probably not any more than 50 yards. He climbs out of the mountain. I'm yelling, Sammy, get back in, get back in. And then he took a direct hit from a rocket. And in my eyes, he disappeared. But I knew that he was dead. I mean, there was no ifs and buts about him being dead. Uh, he disappeared because there wasn't much of Sammy left. So we lost Sammy that day, and that cinched it for me that no more friends. I'll talk to the few friends I have, my fellow boat crew, but I'm done interacting and done socializing.
I'm always interested in what happens, when you see this kind of thing, what happened to Sammy when you see that. Um, then what happens to you, your own mental state? Is it just something you see and then 10 seconds later you're just back focusing on whatever you have to focus on? Is it you kind of, it takes you a minute to
You
process?
hit it. You hit it for river rainforest. I think for any of those guys that are actually in combat units, yeah, you don't have time to dwell on it. You've got to refocus right back to the job at hand because you're needed. You got to be doing stuff. Uh, we had to move out of that firefight and move on to where the troops were going to be picked up later that afternoon, early evening.
Wow.
So
Yeah, and is that one of those things where you kind of don't process it at all, so long as you're in Vietnam and it's only later on, maybe back when you're back in the world, or is there a time when you're in Vietnam where you kind of process it a bit?
I didn't process it at all in Vietnam. Zero. Uh, I don't think I processed it. And in fact, I know when I start. Well, I know when I started processing it. It was about 1986, 25 years later, and it put me in the psych ward when I started processing it.
You do your tour in the Mekong, you see plenty of combat, and no one is going to offer any criticism if you say, all right, I've done my time in the Mekong, I've seen plenty of combat now. Rest of my Navy career, I'm just going to hang out on a supply ship, in the Atlantic or something. But you volunteer to go back, right? Yeah,
You said the key words right there. You mentioned supply ship
yeah.
when uh, when I was in Vietnam, and they asked for a dream sheet. Where do you want to go next? Well, by the time I was being asked that, marriage plans were being made to the girl I had rejected to go to Vietnam. And I thought, any ship out of Long Beach would just be fantastic. Any ship. I don't mind what it's going to be. So I got what's called a refueler.
All right.
And I mentioned earlier that I was the designated radio man aboard the boat, where a radio man on a Tango boat is not like a radio man on a ship. There is no comparisons. On the boat, I talked into a mic and I monitored some radios and heard guys talking and told the boat captain what was going on. A radioman on the ship does mostly sit at a desk teletype, and I can't type. So I went aboard ship as a rated radioman. I mean, that's my supposedly assignment. And I had a brand new ensign in charge of the radio shack, and he liked me, but he'd heard about officers being fragged in Vietnam. Here he's got this young guy, 20 years of age, who is combat hardened. He doesn't want to tell me to learn how to type. He doesn't want to tell me hardly anything. So he gives me a choice assignment to go up on deck of the ship and supervise the chip painting crews with the bosuns and bosun mates and
Yeah.
the deckhands.
All right.
So he sent me up, and after about 2 weeks of, well, when I first went up, I jumped right in with the guys and started chipping paint because it was kind of fun. It was, you just kind of lose your mind chipping away at paint so you could repaint the ship. And I got pulled aside by the ensign and the both ships' bosun's mate and said, Center, you can't chip paint with the paint chippers. You have to supervise, you have to watch them chip paint. And that's, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Go out and go outside and watch the grass grow and keep yourself occupied. And after about two
Yeah.
weeks of that,
I can.
the Navy had a rule that if you wanted to go back to Vietnam and serve in Vietnam, you could request it and the Navy could not refuse it. So I walked down to the personnel office, said, I want to go back to Vietnam. And the guy goes, Really? And I go, Yeah. And I got orders back to Vietnam.
Wow. So is that decision, and uh, it's a decision that, as you describe it, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, here you are in the Mekong, involved in things that are literally a matter of life and death, making decisions that are extremely important, um, and experiencing the most intense kind of stuff that a human being can experience. And now you're watching guys chipping paint. It's
Yeah.
not hard to understand why a young man would say, I'd rather be back doing something terrible as it was that seemed meaningful rather than doing this. Does that get at your own thought process?
That hits it exactly nail the head of the nail for me. I probably should have told my wife that, but I forgot to tell her I wanted to go back. And I just came home one day and said I'm going back to Vietnam. That's not good in a marriage, not good at all. But yeah, I was happy to go back. And even when I got to Da Nang, they didn't know what to do with me because they said you don't type. There's no point in you being in a Radio Shack because we don't have time to go teach you to type. And in fact, a lot of their typing was more Morse code even in those days. So they didn't know what to do with me. And I said, Well, you got any boats anywhere? And they go, Yeah, we got some boats to DMZ. I said, Send me up there. I know how to drive a boat. And so they sent me to the DMZ to drive a boat on the Qua Viet River.
So did the war feel different then? So just the terrain is very different. Obviously, the Mekong is very different from Northern I-Corps, and just in terms of what the terrain is like. Um, how about how the war felt? Because late 67, I don't think we're talking about Vietnamization yet. We haven't experienced Tet yet.
Oh,
But then you get through all that in your first tour. Now your second tour, now we're talking about Vietnamization. Now we're talking about handing the base there, is it the Navy base at Qua Viet, the small Navy base there?
yes, maybe.
Handing that over to the South Vietnamese, this process of Vietnamization. So how did the war feel different in that respect? Did it in the second tour, did it feel more like we're here kind of holding the door open while people are getting out? Or, just how did the war feel different in that respect in terms of whether we're here to win this thing or not?
I'm not sure if there was any real impact of any of that. Certainly not for me, but I almost doubt for the guys on the boats up there based on our function. And we were very isolated from any, we were isolated really from not just political events, but even from military events. Um, as you were getting ready to ask me, I was thinking, okay, down south, as we left, they were talking about the Vietnamization of turning boats over, and it started occurring shortly after I left at the River Division 91. Now, up at the DMZ, it was like they did, they started that whole program south and was working their way north, which makes sense to me because you don't want to do the DMZ first
Oh,
so that
right,
they could be overpowered and overran.
right.
So that didn't occur up there until just weeks before I left. And that was one of the reasons why I was able to get out of Qua Viet because I was turning my boat over. I had to train the new Vietnamese crews on how to do minesweeping. And they were gung ho. They seemed gung ho to me. They wanted to know how to do it. Well, maybe they wanted to stay alive, so they wanted to do it correctly. That might have been a factor too.
Sure.
Or maybe they wanted to do it correctly so they could find the mines or leave the mines so things did get blown up. I don't. They might have been NVA as far as I know, or Viet Cong,
Mhm.
but they were good students. I know that much. I remember that, and we didn't even talk the same language. But it was hands-on training
So
all the
you
way.
so you did have some interaction with South Vietnamese forces then.
But Navy forces, not Army.
Yeah, South Vietnamese Navy. And it sounds like your impression of them is that they were pretty good.
That group I was with, yeah.
Okay.
Now I do remember Vietnamese Army down south on the boats. What I do recall, we preferred not to carry them at that time because it seems like we would get into firefights and stuff would go missing. I'm not saying they were the thieves, but coincidence says that they could have been very easily. We also carried Republic of Korea Marines called Rock.
Right. Wow.
We never had firefights when we had Rock on board. Never, ever had a firefight. We
Is
knew we knew we had an easy operation coming.
I'm assuming that's because the Viet Cong knew that the rocks operated according to a different code.
Yes, different code. I like that word.
Yeah.
Yeah,
In your own words, how would you describe what you knew about the rock forces?
I would think they'd give any match to our Marines,
Yeah.
and maybe in a 6 against 6 fisticuffs, I might give the Rocks. I might bet on the Rocks coming out because they were so scrappy.
Yeah.
They were just so disciplined.
And
Just unbelievable.
and if I've heard they have a reputation for ruthlessness as well when it came to
That's
training.
that's the reputation we were hearing also.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you confident when you left Vietnam the second time? And I wanted to go back and ask you about some of the missions you did on the Qua Viet, but when you left the Vietnam for the second time, if anyone asked you, I don't know if the thought went through your head, but if anyone asked you at the time, do you think the South Vietnamese military is going to be able to stand up and hold this place together? Um, if anyone asked you, did you have any confidence at the time that the South Vietnamese would be able to hold their country?
I don't, looking back, I would say I probably did not have an opinion or a care or a concern. I was home. I had done my time. I was interested in becoming a policeman and or had become a policeman. Nobody talked about it. And I think at that time I didn't really want to talk to anybody about it either.
Yeah.
I probably would have if asked a question, but I wasn't looking to talk to anybody at all.
So you mentioned minesweeping. So that's what you're doing on the Quaviette. So just describe, what if there was such a thing as a typical day on the Quaviette, what are you doing?
All right, get up at sunrise or a little bit before. Get some breakfast if the chow hall hasn't been blown away. Or if it has been blown away, there probably has some kind of food service. You could get some food to eat. Go down to the lighterage, the boat docks. Get on your boat, get it running, make sure it's fully fueled, check out the gear. Two boats will be going out to the river. And each boat hooks up gear to each other that gets strung out between the boats as the boats are going down each side of the river, right at the bank. And so what you're doing is churning up the bottom of the river, trying to find any mines that might have been placed the night before. You're hoping there's no floating mines because you might either run into it or they might be next to you and they detonate it from the land. So
I
the
see.
bottom line is every morning is a suicide run. Two boats, three men on each boat.
And the boats
And
are
you
going
go
side by side down the river?
side by side, well, but space between them,
Right.
going the width of the river, that space between them. And you go up to a little town called Dong Ha. You beat the boats, bring in the gear, looking for. It's almost like fishing. You're fishing for mines instead of for fish. You bring in the gear looking for mines. If you have some in the gear, then you call in UDT, underwater demolition team, to come discharge the mine, and then you sweep back down. And the reason you do this is because they've got supply boats to come up to resupply the Marines and the Army. And those are big boats full of supplies, and you don't want them getting blown up. So it's a lot more effective to lose a small boat and a small crew. The odds are only one of the two boats is going to get hit if you find a mine. And we called finding a mine in the gear or throwing concussion grenades in the water and it blows up because a concussion grenade causes it to go off. It's finding a mine the easy way. We worried about finding a mine the hard way, and that's where the boat hits it, and
Right.
it gets the boat. When I had been down south in the Mekong, we had sent a river division up to Quaviet, and one of our big heavy boats had got flipped out of the water and upside down up at Quaviet, and the whole crew was lost.
What percentage of missions would you say did you find a mine? Would it be maybe one out of five there'd be a mission, something like that? Or there'd be a mine
Now, having it in the gear, I think that's a good number.
about 1 in 5 times?
About 1 in 5. That's once a week, 1 in 7
Okay.
in the gear. Yeah.
And did these minesweeping boats, did they also come under fire occasionally from, I'm assuming up there? Well, you're gonna have VC up there, but NVA as well. Did they come under fire from?
During that time up there, during the daytime, the odds of being shot at were quite slim because that area, the perimeters of the banks on both sides, there'd be a lot of Marines out there on patrol or dug in or listening posts, observation posts, maneuvering. So you didn't really have to worry about being shot at by daytime. And at nighttime, you weren't on the rivers. In Mekong, we were on the rivers all the time at nighttime.
Right.
But up north, no, there was no traffic on the river.
My understanding is that you're dealing with the consequences of Agent Orange right now. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
How do you remember how you came into contact with Agent Orange? Was that down in the Mekong?
Definitely in the Mekong. I really don't know if at all in the Quab yet because I think maybe they already used it because it was just clear banks. But I know that they used some of our boats to spray it. Looking back, I know that we ate local produce that had been sprayed, probably without it being washed off, and certainly with plants trying to grow with it. So there is no, well, you figure Admiral Zumwalt is the one who authorized it for the Delta, and his son died with a related cancer. It kind of tells you that it was a given that it happened to almost any of the guys on the boats had, and a lot of Ninth Infantry had a lot of exposure.
You know, one of the letters you record in your memoir, you write that that you could feel that you were changing, and you say, "I'm changing in my thinking." Um, how do you think your experience in Vietnam changed you?
The boy that went to Vietnam, Tom Center, was not the boy that came back. The boy was gone. I'm not saying I came back a man, although I was. I still had a lot of maturing to do and a lot of mental growing to do, but boyhood was gone. It was erased 100% because of having to deal with very adult issues of death and dying and uh, the job at hand and being uncomfortable. And so I had, and my thoughts were maturing. And I'm hinting to my folks, I had gone there with this idea of committing suicide. They didn't know that. And my dad didn't know about it till he was on his deathbed at age 95.
Mm.
But those thoughts were starting to change. The desire to not just the lack of desire. Let me back it. Not only was the desire to dying, but the desire to live was gaining momentum, to have a life, to have a purpose, to go do something, to create an environment worth living was starting to emerge.